Great. Welcome everybody to this presentation. The two presenters today are Gemma Bellhouse and Judith Fairbairn. They are going to be talking about developing localized tests to meet real life use of language and numeracy. Judith leads on assessment development projects for the British Council's Global Assessments team, which includes assessment design, item writing, test quality assurance, and bespoke assessment solutions for clients. Areas of expertise include research into rating, speaking and writing tests, online rater training, rating scale development, and equality, diversity, and inclusion in testing. Judith has an MA in language testing from Lancaster University and is studying for a PhD at University College London Institute of Education, focusing on rater decision-making processes when marking speaking tests. Judith is the co-author of the book, Scoring Second Language, Spoken and Written Performances, which is currently being printed. Gemma Bellhouse is the Test Product Quality Assurance Manager within the Global Assessments team at the British Council. She has been working in production and management of language tests since 2015 and has been working closely with Judith and her team now for just over a year. Gemma holds an MSc from Oxford in Applied Linguistics and Second Language Acquisition. Her research interests and experience, besides test quality assurance, include test washback and impact, teacher training, language learning strategies, item writer training, and corpus linguistics. Gemma wrote a book chapter on her research into teacher examiners that was published last year by Springer within a book called Teacher Involvement in High Stakes Language Testing. This is her first time presenting at New Directions. Thanks very much, Judith and Gemma. The floor is yours.
Thank you, William. And thank you for giving us this opportunity to share our test development experiences in global assessments at the British Council. We will discuss specifically how we develop localized tests that meet real life use of language and numeracy. What is localization? This is Sullivan's quote. For a test to be used appropriately in a specific social or educational context, it must be shown to fit with the needs of the context. So Global Assessments has been engaged in a number of projects creating local tests that fit local contexts, and that will be the area we will talk about today. So here are 3 localized tests we have recently developed and delivered that will be used as examples to illustrate 3 test development models. The first test is the Workplace Literacy and Numeracy Test and is a computer-delivered English language and numeracy test. It is used to assess proficiency in speaking, listening, reading, writing, and numeracy. The tests were developed by Global Assessments in collaboration with Skills Future Singapore and with the University of Innsbruck for the numeracy test. The tests are used by Singaporeans without formal qualifications in order to access training and work opportunities. The second test is a speaking test developed as a collaboration between the British Council and the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. It is a university entrance test. The third test is Aptis American and is the British Council's Aptis test adapted for test takers who have studied American English. It was originally created for a client in Colombia, but is now available globally. We will review 3 models of test development using these 3 localized tests as examples to see how the test development models worked in practice. The 3 models are the Localization Model, the Sociocognitive Model, and the Cyclical Model of test development. The first model we used in these projects was the theoretical model of test localization. The tests were all localized variants of the Aptis test. Aptis is a 4 skills computer-delivered general proficiency test. For the 3 localized tests that we'll be looking at today, our team did a level 2 localization. The tests have the same test and task specifications as the global Aptis test, but we made changes to the vocabulary and topics to make the test more accessible within each context. For the WPLN test, we also developed a brand new numeracy test, which falls under the level 5 localization category.
Thank you, Judith. Thanks. Let's look at some examples now. So for the first test, the WPLN test for Singapore, Global Assessments reviewed the content of the aptness test with input from our partners in Singapore. From this review, it was determined we needed to localize some of the language for the context of the culture and the situation. We re-recorded the listening and speaking tests using Singaporean voice talent so that the test takers were more familiar with the pronunciation. There were multiple recording studio informants, and our Singapore partner reviewed the final listening recordings. We also looked at some items that needed to be localized. In this example on the slide with the cars, you can see Singapore uses the dollar rather than the pound. So this was changed, and that's not all that was changed. The actual amount is rather different as well, relatively. So this is because prices for certain goods need to be realistic in tasks, or candidates may start raising their eyebrows. There were other contexts of culture decisions, such as an adjustment to the term gap year in one task, as gap years for Singaporean males is not possible. This is due to their having to complete national service right out of school. And here's another little example from the Numeracy test, which was a new test developed by Global Assessments in collaboration with the University of Innsbruck, which is in Austria. And this was for the purpose of testing numeracy skills. Some of the mathematical symbols and illustrations had to be represented according to the correct pedagogic discourse in Singapore, rather than just taking the Austrian German language standard. As you can see in these images, for example, a right angle is illustrated differently in Singapore and Austria. Our partner SSG in Singapore contributed to the review and approved the numeracy test to be fit for the local context. Now let's look at the second test. These are test specifications you can see on the right here that were used for the BCTS test, which is based on the British Council's aptness speaking tests. We did a level 2 localization. The test has the same specifications as the aptness test, but decisions on content about vocabulary and topics still had to be made. We collaborated with our Japan partner in this case in order to ensure these were correct. These localization decisions were related to culture and situation to ensure fairness. For example, photos that were more familiar to test takers were used, and we also avoided specific topics and domains that were unfamiliar to test takers. And this is called localization by exclusion. We provided extensive item writer training to the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, which included a thorough understanding of the aptness speaking test specifications and how to write the speaking items. The Japan partner then took on responsibility for writing the tests using these specifications. So by having the client write the items, we could then overcome any issues of culture and situation of the context. They would write items that were appropriate for the local situation and culture while still ensuring they met the standardized test specifications. So it therefore became a local product, but still linked to an international framework and the CFR. The Global Assessments team did do another review of quality assurance of the tests to ensure that each task met the specifications. And I don't expect you to be reading the specifications right now. They're obviously a bit small here, but all of the test specifications are on our website, and the link is here on the slide, and the slides will be shared to all conference attendees. Now, for the third case study, due to my own personal life experience of living in both England and in the US, this is a project that I carried out myself, along with the contributions from multiple American recording studio informants and many dictionaries and a test panel review as well. As it was a test for South America, it was named Aptness American. As you can imagine, this is a case of looking at the British language and adapting it for an American context. And to do this, I adopted the model of the context of situation of a text from systemic functional linguistics. I treated each test item as a text and reviewed it for aspects of field, tenor, and mode. These come from systemic functional linguistics. So as you can see in the left red column there, the categories field, tenor, and mode. The aptus skills or components are in the top red row, and all the amends to the test were separated into these categories. So for field, this refers to the content, for example, a phone number being changed, or the word holiday to vacation. For the purposes of a localization project, the field category is probably the most obvious one to recognize. Then we have tenor. This refers to the change of language due to the social relationship of the speaker to the reader or listener. For example, changing the word quite to really. The tenor can refer to social classes within context, which can definitely arise between American and British Englishes, as British English vocabulary is often understood perfectly well, but maybe just not used in the same way by the same people. So for example, you wouldn't generally hear a 20-year-old American male say that his evening with his parents was quite lovely. And finally, the category mode. This refers to the channel of communication and the technical linguistic elements of the language. This type of change could represent adapting a spoken text to become a written text, but for the purposes of this localization project in context, most of the changes were related to slight amendments of spelling and the occasional verb tense. Implementing American accents and the tone, maybe, for the speaking and listening recordings also falls under the mode category. And now for the second model that we use for our localization projects, this is the Sociocognitive Model of test development. The objective in using and implementing the second model in localization projects is to produce quality local texts that achieve the overall aims of all stakeholders. We were interested in thinking carefully about the impact of stakeholders on the test development, and then vice versa. What is the impact of test development on all the stakeholders? So let's look at this model in keeping with the 3 test examples, and keep in mind this question. Does this model work for all types of localization projects, and why? And do all stakeholders need to be involved? Or could this model be improved, or maybe only used in a limited way? So let's use this second model and go back to our first test example, the Singapore WPLN test. First, let's look at the consequences and impact of stakeholders on the test development and surrounding test materials. For the test takers who hadn't used a computer before, for example, they required training. Test development considered adapting the test for this purpose. And for the parents and caregivers who needed to support the test takers but didn't have a high level of English, we created a shorter, simplified candidate guide. For the teachers, there were webinars and test familiarization sessions. And for the administration, there have been special needs and accommodations training for local staff on how to administer a computer test and also how to resolve technical issues. Then, considering the consequences and impact of the test on the stakeholders, such as the test takers, the broader society, and the policymakers, well, the framework existed already, and we did standard setting to make sure that the test scores on the new assessment reflected the framework. But there has been impact on teaching. Already, the training providers have modified their curriculum, which is evidence of impact. The test takers and teachers are getting used to the new test preparation and test familiarization materials. There is some impact research being carried out actually currently in Singapore by the Impact and Evaluation Team and Global Assessments. And perhaps at the next New Directions conference, one of our team members will be presenting on this very subject. Now let's look at the Sociocognitive Model and its application for BCTS. The objective here was to produce a quality local test that achieved the overall aims of all stakeholders, including a cross-national team of test developers, test takers, and policymakers. Firstly, how do the stakeholders impact on the test? Well, when we do test development, we think of all stakeholders and the consequences and impact they have. And there was a change in government policy that required universities to use 4 skills in their language testing when making admissions decisions for university entry, but they did not need to develop their own test. And this is where we came in. The main stakeholders who impacted on the test design were the test developers in Japan. So what about the consequences and impact of the test on the stakeholders then? We also thought about how the test impacts and has consequences on each of them. For example, the impact of or washback of the test on teaching at high school or secondary level if speaking is tested. The British Council in Japan has provided training to high school teachers to help them understand the construct of the tests. And in one innovative project, we translated the aptitude speaking rating scale and the speaking test into Japanese, and then tested the Japanese language of our staff speaking Japanese as a second language. This activity worked really well to help the teachers understand the construct of what was being tested and why. And now let's just look briefly at the consequences and impact of and the sociocognitive model for American aptitude. Firstly, how do the stakeholders impact on the test? Well, the test takers wanted a test aligned to their learning, consistent with their curriculum in the American language, and the employers expected the test to represent the American use of English. So this was the face validity of the test. And teachers wanted a test that would be aligned to the learning, consistent with the curriculum, just like the test takers. The broader society, of course, impacted on the test because it was American English in the region. And then going the other way, the consequences and impact of the test on stakeholders. The test takers now have a better test taking experience. This is a more valid test for their purpose. And just like Barry's quote that Judith gave earlier, this test is fit for purpose. For the teachers and employers, this change just supports the teaching and it supports the employment. The employers are more likely to accept the score, obviously, if the language reflects their own context. So we'll now move on to the third model. Back to you, Judith.
Okay, so the third model of test development that we used was the cyclical model of test development. So the model that we use in global assessments is an ongoing cycle of review, evaluation, and change, and starts at the top with the rationale for any test development. So we then put together our project plan, needs analysis, and we presented this to the global assessments test panel for review and approval. The test is then designed and raters and item writers are trained, item writing and quality assurance takes place. The test is first piloted and then we do a large scale field trial. We also do standard setting. All the results are analyzed and the content and specifications are changed based on this analysis. The test is then administered in a live environment and then monitoring takes place and could lead to a rationale for more test development, although the rationale for development becomes more of a rationale for revision. So how did this model perform in our 3 test development projects? For the Singapore WPLN test, we accepted the contract before the project planning and needs analysis had been fully done. So there wasn't actually a test panel review. And this did mean that many of our decisions needed to be made as the project progressed and not entirely laid out from the beginning. The speaking and writing tests were marked by our pool of raters, and it was a level 2 localization only for speaking. So no rater training was needed. However, there was extensive training on how to write numeracy items for a pool of mathematics experts at the University of Innsbruck. And this was a challenge. These were not item writers. So for example, the mathematics item writers were quite comfortable with 2 correct answers. So 3 + 3 = 6, and so does 4 + 2, which was quite different than for language testing. So there needed to be a lot of quality assurance for the language they were using, as well as ensuring that the language is actually at the A2 level. A lot of the questions they were asking, putting into their items were quite complicated. And we also had to come up with a list of mathematical concepts that were obviously quite high level, but required for this test. The client also wanted to sign off on each numeracy item, so that was an added step at the revision of content and specification stage, and also required language assessment literacy training for our clients. For the Japan BCTS test, the steps in the model were followed quite well. At the time, the test panel didn't exist when we started this project. And reviewing it in this way has made me realize how important it is to bring together all stakeholders at the British Council into a test panel. So for example, having a meeting with the assessment research group, the business development team, my team, the assessment development team, and also the operations team is really important to ensure that all areas are considered. So in this project, it is a logistical challenge to deliver all the speaking tests on one day at scale. So you know, we need to consider computer availability, internet availability, and IT training for administrators to troubleshoot. So by now having the test panel, we can really think through these operational delivery issues and not only focus on test development. For Aptus American, we used existing Aptus content and then adapted the tests for an American market, English language market. So we made the principled compromise that we did not need to conduct piloting or trialing or standard setting. There was no change to the specification other than a one-line reference to the American pronunciation, content, and spelling. So instead, we had discussions with British Council's assessment research group and used an expert panel to make decisions. So I think in this case, because we have skipped this section, the monitoring is going to become more important to see what the differences are there. So how did these models work in practice? The models were very helpful as a framework for developing localized tests. For the localization model, we have added a documentation process for how localization decisions are made. We call it the review, reflect, and record model. We review the tests to ensure they meet the specifications. We reflect on the decisions using an expert panel to make sure localization decisions meet high standards of testing, and we record and document all these changes. The Holiday framework of field, tenor, and mode is helping with the documentation. We found the localization model worked well in deciding in practice in deciding with clients exactly how much customization is required. As you move up the levels, the cost and time increases. So it's a good tool to start a discussion and limit and also expand the potential changes. For the socio-cognitive model, we needed to systematically review, reflect, and record the consequences and impact of the stakeholders on the test development and the consequences and impact of the test on the stakeholders. We also need to consider the full education system more widely when we look at stakeholders. And again, we really need to consider operational delivery as a crucial part of test development and a really important stakeholder. For the cyclical model of test development, we need to review, reflect, and record why any of the steps are missing or why steps are added and document the reasons. We also, again, need to add a step for the development of support materials and operational delivery. Thank you very much. This was put together by 4 colleagues in the assessment development team.
Thank you very much, Judith and Gemma. That was a very interesting presentation. I have a question. What's the biggest challenge that you face in localization?
I'll go first, Gemma. I guess the biggest change is probably the stakeholders, actually, of what, you know, people think test development is an easy thing to do, and sort of they might ask for things that are very expensive, time consuming, but they want the test on Monday, sort of thing. So I think it's kind of this language assessment literacy training for everyone involved, and sometimes the people involved are not testers, and so just being able to explain the process and really understand the needs. Because sometimes people think that they need something, but actually they don't. You know, sometimes I've worked on several projects now where we've done the needs analysis and they've come back to, well, actually just normal Aptus is good enough. I mean, we just want a general proficiency English test. We don't need it to be so specific or localized. So I think that's probably one of the challenges. What do you think, Gemma? Do you have any other challenges?
I think you hit the nail on the head there. There's not a major difference between the challenges of actually just normal test development and localization challenges, because we have to make sure that all stakeholders are involved will be happy, satisfied, and are provided with a reliable and valid test. So it's in some parts exactly the same challenges. For the American Aptis localization, the challenge was to definitely try to catch every single Britishism. So that took multiple reviews and multiple, read-throughs and just verifying multiple times that yes, it's definitely not something that's usually said in America. So that was a funny little challenge, which was quite fun for me, actually.
Did you do that alone, or did you have an English person or a British person to run it by to see if they agreed with you?
It's a funny question because I am British.
Oh, right. Apologies. Sorry.
No.
You have an American accent, it seems.
I have a bit of it's a bit of a hybrid accent, because when I go to the US, they think that I'm British and I get very confused.
Okay, so I'll ask the question again. Did you have someone from the US that you would bounce the ideas off to make sure that you hadn't missed any?
I used, as I mentioned earlier, I used a lot of dictionaries, but I also used Judith has experience from North America as well, having lived in Canada, and also the American voices in the studio, they were used as informants, and we also had an expert panel review for several of the changes, because we wanted to make sure that any changes as well didn't impact then on the actual construct validity of the test. So I definitely consulted many sources.
Thanks. We've got a few questions here. The first is from Luke Harding. He says, thanks, Gemma and Judith. Very interesting. This question's for you, Gemma. Is your research on the Halliday approach in localization published anywhere?
Absolutely. I think it is on the slide. There's a reference there if we go back. But also, it's so funny because I didn't predict this happening, that somebody would ask about systemic functional linguistics there. We see a Halliday. Oh, no, we didn't include it in the end. We just included the birth date. I'm happy to send you several references, Luke, or I can maybe plug it into the chat in a moment. But if you have questions about systemic functional linguistics, my colleague Joanna, who was the one who educated me about about these categories, her email address is right there. I think, Luke, you already know Joanna, and she absolutely pushed me to say, if anybody asks, I want to talk to them. So feel free to consult her as well.
Thank you very much. Here's another question. This is from Caroline Rogers. She says, in response to that, and then quote, catching every single Briticism, especially in more foreign contexts, how do you know when that work is done? How do you ensure that you've localized, firstly, appropriately, and secondly, enough?
Oh, I mean, I think this now probably is going to overlap into the test development process and ensuring that the test is fit for purpose. So I feel, and the expert panel feels, that we definitely did review the test enough, the changes were sufficient, but that's more from the meta review, the theoretical review. So we need to see this now in practice, and we will be monitoring the results and also getting feedback from our stakeholders.
Thank you. I think there's time for one more question. Catherine Hughes says, how long did it take you to review Aptis American? That's to you, Gemma.
Yes, actually, this was one of my lockdown projects. So it started in May. I think it was complete in August. It didn't take that long, and I definitely didn't spend the entire time just reading over these tests. But actually, it was good to have some space in between the reviews and to go back a few weeks or a month later. I actually threw in an extra final review, which did manage to pick up, I think, a couple of spelling inconsistencies. There were so many favorites, for example, making sure favorite had didn't have the U in it.
Great, thank you very much, Judith, Gemma. That was a very interesting chat, and everybody who attended, thank you very much for attending. This is the end of this session. I think we have a half-an-hour break, and then we will kick off the rest of the afternoon sessions. Thanks very much, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye,
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Hi, Neil. Are you there?
Yeah.
Awesome. So do I just end the session and then it should download all the videos?
Yeah, it should start doing its thing right away.